Held on to love.
Yeah, so this is the first time I'm at the GMI campus, and I've been planning to come here for so long. But I finally got an opportunity to visit and look at this amazing facility. And as soon as you enter, you just feel inspired to be creative, to learn. And there's this thriving community of students that I got to interact with, and each at a very high level of skill, of soulfulness. The kind of musical conversations we were able to have as a community were very special, and that just shows the kind of mentorship, the quality of mentorship they've been getting here. We need to balance our devotion to our craft with what we do outside, and a space like this is really helping students manage both aspects. Yeah, just come and become real and become fierce. This is the place.
Hello, I'm Gal Heading. I'm a music producer and engineer, and I'm the director at Berkeley Abu Dhabi. I'm delighted to be here at GMI. It's been an amazing experience to get to know the faculty, to get to know the students. The stuff that's happening here musically is amazing. The facilities are really, really nice and comfortable and conducive to creativity. One of the things that was really, really exciting to do today at my time at GMI was hearing students' works and their productions and their songs. And I was really thrilled to see the depth that they're bringing to their projects musically, and sort of like the emotion that they're able to bring. Some of them, they're just starting, and some of them are quite advanced, but I was delighted to see how varied and how rich the music that they're doing is. So I also learned a lot myself from hearing their music. I hope to come back again, and now that Berkeley Abu Dhabi is right next door, we hope to be connecting and working together more and more.
Hi, I'm Ritnika Nain. I am the country head of CD Baby in India, and I'm also the owner of Music Gets Me High. It's been great, actually seeing the new campus after all this time, courtesy of the pandemic. But I'm really happy to see what GMI has done here, and it is absolutely lovely. I think in order to succeed in music, you need to have a good foundation. And it is really important to have good instructors and good teachers who can guide you through the process. It's really refreshing to see what GMI is doing here. I love the campus, and they have great people teaching, people with a lot of experience. And I do believe that they're one of the few institutions, along with a couple others in the country, that are really helping shape the Indian music industry.
Yeah, so welcome guys. This is Jazzing in India, which is part of Swaratmika'. Swaratmika' is the fest of audiophile, which is the Music of Shahid Basic College. It is organized in partnership with GMI Global Music Institute, and right now we have amazing people joining us with us today. So everyone, if you can just give a quick introduction of yourself, we can proceed.
Why don't you call out a name and that person can introduce me?
So Arjun, let's start with you.
Sure. Hey, I'm Arjun Sagar Gupta. I'm the founder of the Piano Man Clubs.
Sarthak.
Hi, my name is Sarthak. I've been doing radio for 22 years.
Naresh.
My name is Naresh Fernandes. I am a journalist in Bombay, and I'm interested in the history of Western music in India.
Aditya.
Hi, everybody. My name is Aditya Balani. I am a musician and educator. I am the co-founder and director of GMI, Global Music Institute.
And Shubh.
Hello, my name is Shubh Saran. I am a guitarist and a composer, and and a big admirer of everybody on this Zoom chat also.
The feeling is entirely mutual, Shubh. So
thank you. You're the only one who said that, so thanks.
I thought Shubh was also the eye candy for the conversation.
Oh yeah. I'm not going to say very much.
Is that the reason why he's here?
It's the reason why I'm in most places.
So we should start. So Naresh, my first question is to you. Can you tell us a little bit about how jazz, being an American art form, how it came to India, and how was that whole journey for jazz like as an art form?
Sort of India has always been part of the circulation of global culture, and that really speeded up from about the 1850s when the Suez Canal was opened. And that really cut the distance between Europe and India, and then things were really flowing through. And so all sorts of music was coming to India on gramophone records. And so you had, first, of course, before the introduction of the gramophone, you had performers coming through. You had opera companies going through India. You had a sort of pop form that was called minstrelsy, which was essentially white people in blackface with black makeup doing sort of imitations of what was black life. And these guys these companies went through Asia, and because India was sort of the closest stop to the Suez Canal, they would stop in Bombay and then make their way through the subcontinent. And eventually many of them found their way through to Shanghai. And so when jazz sort of became popular around the world, it was only natural that jazz would come to India. Jazz had there was the happy coincidence of the fact that jazz came of age around the time that the gramophone began to be mass produced. And so Indians heard jazz on these sort of shellacs before, I think, bands began to perform it. But it wasn't long before Indian bands began to play this stuff. And then American bands began to come here. But jazz, by that time, had become it became a global form very quickly. And so musicians around the world began to play this stuff. So India's first jazz record in 1927 was actually cut by a band that was included in American, but it was led by a Canadian guy. It had a guy from Mozambique in it, and it had a Russian guy in it. And there's a wonderful picture of this. They were called the Lequim's Orchestra. They were playing in Calcutta at the time. There's a fantastic picture of all of them wearing solar topis, performing, sort of hamming it up for a publicity photograph in the Calcutta Zoo as an elephant sort of trumpets over them. But to me, that really encapsulates how quickly jazz had become a global form, and how India received a global form of jazz.
Right. So the musicians, these musicians, they came to India, and then slowly, I guess, tell me if I'm wrong over here. First, there was the scene that was built up in Calcutta, and then slowly from there, as the economy in Bombay grew, as the Taj Mahal, the ballroom it opened there were many other places over there. So I guess from Calcutta then to Bombay, the scene shifted. So
it wasn't actually. This was happening everywhere, all at the same time. And one of the things I realized as I began to read, but also talk to the families of some of those pioneer musicians, was the fact that jazz was everywhere. And especially because of the railways, because of the army and cantonment towns, there were bands literally in the smallest corners of India. I interviewed a Filipino guy whose father and mother had sort of played in Jamalpur, in what is now Bihar, in the 1930s. And they would play, sort of in the biggest town in the district on the weekend for people in the Railway Institute, and then spend the rest of the week going up and down on the trains, playing at smaller and smaller and smaller towns. So this stuff was really getting around. And so I don't think, there was, we in big cities, of course, sort of the bands with the biggest names were playing there because that's where there was the most money. But there were amateur bands and semi-amateur bands, semi-professional bands playing this stuff literally sort of in the smallest corners of India.
But Mr. Fernandes, I read.
Naresh.
Sure. I think it'll take me a little time to get the sir away from Naresh. So please bear with me with the sir for a few moments till I get comfortable.
I'm not yet an uncle, man. What you're saying.
Okay, Naresh is okay. I read about there's these fascinating stories about these railway towns, these little railway towns that had become the hub of Anglo-Indians, where jazz was also flourishing in a bit. But I'm going to draw a little bit of a fashion parallel here. In fashion, there's always the first movers who sort of take the first vibes and then capture it, and then it percolates down into being mass fashion. So at this point of time where there were a lot of these bands that were coming in, bringing jazz with them, was this socio-economically in that way a phenomenon that was more or less restricted to the Anglo-Indians / those influenced by those working in the railways, etc., or was it actually percolating down to the guy who's wearing the dhoti and going about his day as well?
So my sense is that everybody heard this music in some way, and soon this music had become an element in film music across the country. And Calcutta was also a big film production center in addition to Bombay. And it was also in the regional film industries. And so everybody heard an element of this swing, even if they didn't know what it was called.
Sure.
But it became part of Indian pop in a variety of languages very soon.
And there were some superstars, weren't there? I mean, Chick Chocolate, for example, was a. Tell us about the personalities. Of course, this is the more dour Excel sheet version of how jazz spread. But there's the juice of jazz as well, which was actually flowing quite freely at that point of time in the clubs and sort of lifting its skirts up in that sense, wasn't it?
Yeah, there were some communities. So India has always had a gharana tradition, in Hindustani music especially.
Yeah.
But there were, for instance, many Goans who played music as a profession, and their families had done this for generations, and just played the new style that had come along. So when it was Viennese, these chaps were playing Viennese waltzes. When it became, light opera, these guys played light opera. And when jazz became the hot new thing around the world, of course, they had to give their clients what they wanted.
Sure.
The Goans, in addition to the Anglo-Indians in another way, the Goans had a very strong tradition of Western music because, those Portuguese, much as we like to mythicize what they did nothing. They set up no industries.
Right.
So Goans traditionally, they set up a medical college. One brother would become a doctor, one brother would become a priest, and the third guy would go off to Africa because there were no prospects for him in India. But some of them became musicians, and so they took to this. They began to play this music, and some of them pretty soon realized that there was something in the music that really told their own stories, that reflected something that was going on inside their heads. Among the characters I sort of spoke to a lot was a guy called Frank Fernandes, who had been born Frank Fernandes and then decided Fernandes wasn't a cool name, something I vehemently disagreed with him about. But when I met him, I met him quite by chance. I knew it was I was trying to explore this story, and I had friends who lived down the road. I knew their father was a musician. I said, can I come see him? They said, sure, but he's not very well. And when I went to see Frank Fernandes, he had Parkinson's disease, which was quite severe. So he would be in a wheelchair, and then he would be sort of wheeled out, and I would ask him these questions, and he would tense up. And then 4 or 5 sentences would come up. And then he would slump back again. And I feel really bad about put this man through it. But it's clear he wanted to talk. And he began to tell me these stories about a guy called Cricket Smith he had played with in Bombay, and other American names that meant nothing to me. Until one day I began to look at one of those sort of standard American sort of history books, early jazz history, a guy called Gunter Schuller. And then it blew my mind. I realized that this guy, Cricket Smith, had actually been part of these jazz, especially one led by a guy called James Rees Europe in France, in just between the wars. And he had, this band had been instrumental in transforming jazz from this form called ragtime, which was a more sort of basic form, into a more sophisticated form of jazz. Cricket Smith was there. There was another guy called Teddy Weatherford, who had was considered to be sort of, he was a contemporary of Louis Armstrong's in Chicago before he left to come to Asia in the 1920s, and he died in Calcutta almost 3 decades later. And so these guys had been fairly sort of proficient players at the top of their game when they came to India, and they taught these guys how to play. Frank Fernand was among those who really sort of took to jazz. And he had a transformative moment in the 1940s. He was playing with a band led by a Parsi guy who had been born Khavasji-Khatau, but Khavasji-Khatau is not a very cool name either, so he changed his name to Rudy Cotton. And they were in Mussoorie playing at Hackman's Hotel. And Gandhi came up because sort of he came to get the talks, sort of he had been discussing the modalities of independence with a British delegation and came up to clear his head, and he was giving discourses every day. And Frank Fernand heard him talk, and that changed his life. He decided that he wanted to find an Indian way to play jazz. And he went back and began to take sort of music lessons, to listen to his contemporaries, especially in the film studios, who came from the Hindustani tradition. And by the 1940s, Frank Fernand, we know only from program notes because there were no recordings, was playing an Indian form of jazz. And so he's among the guys who I was really quite impressed by. And ironically, by the time his story fell together in my head, Frank was too old to be able to fill in all the details that I would have liked him to tell. Chick Chocolate was born Antonio Xavier Vaz, and we're not quite sure how he got his nickname. Family thinks that it may be some sort of residue of 1940s slang, where if you were playing something really cool, everybody would say, hey, that's really chick, man. But we don't know. And he again sort of, he cut his teeth playing a kind of sort of Goan musical theater called Khels. And there are sort of related forms, there's Theat and Khel theater. And he then came to Bombay and began to play jazz, and he was noted as to be a Louis Armstrong imitator. And he would growl evidently and sort of would sing in this sort of Louis Armstrong fashion. And on his stage, in his stage shows, his pièce de résistance at the end of his shows would be, he would sink to his knees and raise his horn to his to the stars. Louis Armstrong did come to India in the mid-1960s. And his children told me the story of how one day they were all bundled together, woken up early in the morning, taken to the Taj Mahal Hotel, lined up outside the lift. Louis Armstrong came out with a suitcase and said, bye, I'm going away, I'm going to the airport, and disappeared. So they caught a sighting of Louis Armstrong, but nobody knows whether Chick Chocolate actually jammed with Louis Armstrong. Did he have long conversations with him? And it's one of those things you just wonder about. But he was again another great character, and it was lovely to be able to try to reconstruct his life.
And it's so great to listen to the stories, no, even if some of them were part of the imagination as well.
Exactly.
That's what folklore is all about, and music is all about stories. And then, of course, it's fascinating to see the fact that jazz, when it started, was a sort of a breaking free from the slavery of habit and from the socio-economic problems. And even in India, it sort of developed through the fact that, there was exposure to Gandhi, there was exposure to revolutionary ideas. And I think by the 70s, we had a sort of a jazz vocabulary that was uniquely Indian, wasn't it? I mean, wasn't this the part when the likes of Steve Sequeira and Derek Julian, etc., they were making their music, and they were sort of, going out there. Roy Venkatraman, he went out and played with the Wailers, etc. Was that the time, or am I missing out?
I think that sort of the foundations for that were laid in an earlier period.
Sure.
Some of it in an art form way by people like Frank Fernand, and others in a more organic way in the film studios. And they were really sort of, and so showbiz just sort of made it necessary for people to sex it up for the audience.
And they were actually, and there were these orchestras who were playing literal, as you said, ragtime and swing. These were big 20, 30 piece orchestras. They were making that music for Mera Naam Chin Chin Choos and all of that, which was
exactly. And so when you look at the photographs of the Hindi film orchestras of that period, it's quite difficult to tell the difference between a Hindi film orchestra and the orchestra at the Taj.
Sure.
They had the same instruments. They were playing them in a different way. But yeah, so there was this sort of, it was happening in two ways. It was happening in this organic way in the film studios as a way of just, creating appealing music that people would listen to. But also there were people who were doing it, as art music. There was something called the Bombay Swing Club in the 1940s, not to be sort of confused with the Bombay Swingers Club. And they again were sort of, their program notes make it clear that they wanted jazz democratic music, that they wanted the mill worker and the secretary to listen to this music according to their club brochures. So,
I actually have a question. Sorry, if I may. Since we're talking about a little bit of the earlier period, so obviously, we've seen a lot of racial undercurrents in the early acceptance of jazz. It was like this dirty music, and there were these phases that sort of happened. But when jazz came to India, was it seen through that similar light, or was very sort of novel and people were like, so I just want to understand from a social context, how was it perceived in the earlier sort of period before we move on to the next sort of periods, moving ahead?
Yeah, so there seem to have been, Aditya, a few sort of British clerics who were Puritans who did this music. But otherwise, for India's upper classes, who were the first audiences for this stuff, it was the chance to, be like your contemporaries everywhere else in the world. And you wanted to demonstrate that you could do this. And they didn't sort of, they weren't able to demonstrate this very effectively. Leon Abbey, who was supposed to have led the first all Negro band in India in 1935, to use the very racist phraseology of the time. Sort of the African-American musicians traveling through Asia and through the world was a source of great pride for African-Americans at home.
Right.
And the African-American press followed this quite closely. A paper called the Chicago Defender, which wrote about African-American affairs at home. It covered the civil rights movement. And it had a column called Across the Pond, where it wrote about these bands. And their correspondent was a guy called Wiggins. And he reported that when Leon Abbey first began to play at the Taj, his sort of rhythms were so quick that Indian audiences couldn't keep up, and they begged him to slow down.
Wow, that's interesting.
That was quite interesting to see. And sort of the politics and the jazz always went almost simultaneously. And so in that summer, in that season of 1935, when Leon Abbey was the first African-American band to come to India, there was also a preacher called Howard Thurman, who was from Howard University, who came to India, and he was leading the first African-American delegation to come to India. And so the Chicago Defender, in addition to talking about music, was also talking about the civil rights movement. And they were all looking at Gandhi. They had been writing about Gandhi since the 1920s.
Right.
In 1935, Howard Thurman and his delegation came to India. They gave a speaking tour. And of course, then they wanted to meet their African-American counterparts who were playing up the road at the Taj, who were playing jazz. And so in Howard Thurman's diaries, he writes about how they met up with Teddy Weatherford, who took out to his establishment. They don't name the establishment that he was playing at, but the sort of high point of that menu was ice cream. So they ate ice cream with Teddy Weatherford. And eventually they went off to Bardoli outside Surat to meet Gandhi. And Gandhi ended that meeting by saying, "Sing me Negro spirituals." And so in the Gujarat night, they sang "Climbing Jacob's Ladder" and "Were You Crucified, My Lord." So, you know, these things were sort of quite tightly wound. It's sort of like a DNA double helix. Music always going together.
That's absolutely.
In the ballrooms, something different was happening.
Amazing. Thank you for answering that. Thank you.
Food and jazz, of course, have had a very long and enduring connection, which Arjun is taking forward with his piano man as well in the contemporary. Of course, guys, please feel free to jump in and ask questions. I mean, this is as free-flowing a conversation as it is. So
I think until we reach about 2000, for us, it's a masterclass.
Yeah,
our contribution can only come in after, because everything we know about the time period, up till 60s, 70s, whatever, actually does come from the Taj Mahal Foxtrot, which is, and since Mr. Fernandes is there,
Yeah, needs to be said. Anyone who's looking to get a definitive idea about how jazz developed should probably just pick up Taj Mahal Foxtrot.
Definitely.
And that's just about, I mean.
But it's just one of them, because, every few weeks or every few months I'll run into somebody who'll say, "You left out my uncle, you left out." And then I have to sort of dive for cover. So there's a lot of stuff that's not in there. It's a sort of bare bones story of a very history with literally a cast of thousands.
The fascination of a work in progress is that you can always look forward to another Foxtrot being played out in the between the people.
After I wrote my book, all these stories began to emerge, and I had no way to put them in the book. So I had a website called tajmahalfoxtrot.com.
Yeah,
I could hang all these stories that didn't sort of shoehorn, that I couldn't shoehorn into this sort of spine of a book. And I also put up some of the recordings there. So if anybody's interested, that's where you can go. But I mean, we've got to the foundations, and now it's time to talk about where we are now, because it's a contemporary music that's alive. And tradition is important, but where we're at now is really what we should focus on.
But I think sorry.
Please.
No. I was just basically saying that in the jigsaw of the timeline, there's still a few pieces that are empty. They're left a little unattended. So maybe we can follow up from the 40s how music developed into the 50s and the 60s, and how the vibrancy of that, and then it sort of did peter out somewhere in the middle as well. So it'd be great if we could get that timeline from you, Naresh.
So, one of the great ironies, of course, is that in India, jazz has always been dancing music for the most. And so in restaurants, jazz was sort of happening in the background, it was entertainment. And so when jazz was the world's pop, it was popular. Then in the mid-40s, these four chaps from Liverpool came around, and that changed musical tastes. And so, of course, the same the people who'd been in those jazz bands began to play this new thing that at first was called beat music. Began to be called rock and roll. Among sort of the first was a bunch of chaps called the Trojans, who played in Bombay. And then after the Trojans all went off to become, I think, good boys, get jobs, go to college. One guy left. His name was Biddu Appaya. And he then began to call himself the Lone Trojan before Indians realized that actually a brand of prophylactic. And I've always wanted to find a poster saying the lone Trojan. But yeah, so, and then, jazz began to be performed, no, not so much in the clubs, but at concerts. And as it became art music, it developed sort of its own history with a lot of the musicians would, their main job would be to play in Hindi film studios or film studios at any rate across the country. And then they would do this music in the evening. Occasionally, there would be concerts. So
when we talk about this timeline, I mean, so when I sort of talk to my parents and, when I used to talk to speak with my grandparents, I used to hear about how till about the 80s, mid 80s, there was still a sort of burgeoning scene where there were jazz bands playing in restaurants across the city, Delhi, for example, which is also corroborated by my piano teacher who used to play at that time on the scene, John Raphael, along with Mohsin Meneses, and the previous generation of jazz musicians before then. There was a lull for almost 20 years. So it's very perhaps you have some answers about this or some reasons why that sort of early mid 80s till the mid 2000, that 20-year lull in jazz, which, yes, one of the reasons is the pop music of the world changed. But it changed much.
These guys who said they were playing jazz weren't actually only playing jazz. They were playing all sorts of things. When you look at the set lists and even listen to the scratch recordings from that time, I mean, like they're playing some jazz songs. Often it's Autumn Leaves and Summertime. But then they're playing, sort of disco, they're playing funk, they're playing everything. They were showmen. So they had the skills to be able to improvise, and audiences again had the skills to be able to appreciate what was happening. But it wasn't only jazz. There was nobody doing John Coltrane, night after night.
But even that sort of pop jazz space kind of vanished for a while.
Yeah, I suppose.
Delhi, for example, yeah.
To me, it is the fact that, India, like sort of as we set this timeline, India has always listened to what's the new stuff. When minstrelsy is new, hip audiences want to listen to minstrelsy. When jazz is new, that's what they want to listen to. When funk is new, that's what they're doing. And so I don't think we sort of should have any nostalgia for a sort of museumized form. We should just appreciate the fact that they wanted to be contemporary, to be current.
And
sorry.
No, go on, Shubh. Go on.
But on that, how much do you think sort of these more regressive laws like closing clubs?
Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Oh, is this better? Sorry. How's this?
A little better.
Oh, sorry.
How
much do you think? Huh?
I think you need to up the gain a little, Shubh. You're very soft.
I'm maxed out, unfortunately.
Oh, now it's better. I think
good.
Yeah.
I was going to say, how much do you think the sort of these regressive sort of laws like closing of clubs or not allowing alcohol and bands in the same clubs and things like that happened in Bombay, did that have an effect on this scene sort of vanishing for a while? Or was that kind of a separate sort of thing that was going on?
I'm sure it did. I mean, because but Bombay has had prohibition since the 1930s.
I see. Yeah.
In various forms.
Sure.
So, sort of restaurateurs have always complained about license fees, about, alcohol. This is something Arjun knows how difficult it is. And, so, I mean, that's definitely one part of it.
Mm-hmm.
If, the audiences really wanted to listen to this stuff, they would have found ways. I mean, there would have been cover charges,
right.
Would have paid an entrance fee, all sorts of things. So
I mean, two things to that. So one is that what you said will affect, in general, the presentation of live music in a bar or a restaurant, right? So it brings down the availability of exposure to music in general. To live music in general. That's something that, we've been sort of loud about, that what's necessary is exposure.
Yeah.
Second thing, is that is exactly what Naresh said, that whether or not there is live music taking place, the kind of music that's being played is more relevant to what people are listening to. Because for most entrepreneurs and most restaurateurs, it's a tool and not a goal. So music is a tool to bring people in to generate sales, as opposed to being a definite goal that I want to push or create exposure for this form of art.
Yeah,
sure. That makes. But also, Naresh, I think there is a case to be made about legendary venues that had become sort of homes of jazz. I mean, jazz and trinkers in say Kolkata cannot probably be separated at all. What was the role of the non-musicians in sort of the propagation of, or maybe even the tapering off as far as jazz is concerned? What was that role all about?
Sorry, what do you mean by the role of non-musicians?
I'm saying that, like, for example, the owners of venues, etc. So what role did they have to play? For example, is there a story that we don't know about Trinkers, about how it started, how it sort of became what it became in that way? Is there a contribution there as well that we might be missing out on?
I'm sure there were a few sort of venue owners who were really passionate about a certain kind of music. Like in Delhi, there's that guy who runs Piano Man.
Certain gentlemen, yes.
Bands come in, he could be playing disco, dance music.
Sure.
And, so I'm sure there was some, but sort of it's all changed over the year. And, they've been shifting generations. A daddy who liked this stuff, maybe his son wanted to be much more, with it. So yeah, I think it was just that musical taste changed.
Sure.
And
as you said, there was, there were people who were playing jazz and they were experimenting, etc. As I said, Stormfront, at that point of time, Derek from Pune was coming in, and then there was the Louis Banks era of jazz. It'd be great to hear you talk about that a little.
So, but also, in Bombay especially, but also in Delhi, among the things that everybody lived for was this thing called the Jazz Yatra, which started in 1978 and happened every 2 years. And it brought the biggest names of the jazz world in India, again, thanks to the fact that popular tastes had changed. Nobody in America actually wanted to listen to Stan Getz anymore, or that much. And Japanese were interested in him, but you could get Stan Getz to come to India pretty much, for a plane ticket and for a few days at the Taj or the Oberoi. And so that really helped India sort of, or helped Bombay audiences keep up with what was happening in the world. And they also got like the weirdest, this sort of the Jazz Yatra depended on who the embassies would be willing to send. And so you had like, the Norwegian embassy would get into this, and they would send like the wildest free jazz bands, and they would send Dixieland jazz bands. So you'd get these Norwegian tuba players.
Yeah, I've been to those concerts, some of them, and I know what you're talking about.
I think Arjun and I both have had a very intimate experience with that as well. So yeah,
I started with the Jazz Yatra in Delhi. Started working with them when I was still in school as an usher. I tell you, it was incredible. It was like 3 days, 3 golden days of jazz in a year, and there's nothing else.
Yeah,
and and it was at a venue which had really bad sound. I mean, you had to.
It used to be at a hotel, right? For some time, it was by a poolside.
Yeah, by the time I started, I was old enough to go. It was usually at the Kamani or the Fiki or Sai.
Okay.
Yeah, there was also at one point of time the City Fort Auditorium that was used.
Yeah.
Aditya, this was a little. Did you catch the edges of the yatras?
Sorry?
Did you catch the last years of the yatras?
I've been to some of them, and then what you were talking about, like I've had that experience where one, there'll be like a very classic, like 30 sounding band, and then you have this very avant-garde sort of like, and one after the other, and I think audiences were like, what is happening? Like just that context was so out of place for people to just get the hang of it, what's going on, because because obviously the music is, let's say, 100 years apart, in time, but they're being played one after the other. So there is obviously this jarring sort of an effect. And that's why I was laughing when you mentioned that, where we've seen that happen, where unless you've sort of followed that context and you understand the musical sort of language there, doesn't have to be in an educated music way, but in a general sort of way, it can be quite entertaining and to see what's happening. So yeah, that's what I sort of meant in
But
that.
also because I think as jazz fans, we each have maybe a specific period that we really like.
Yeah.
So I'm into hard bop. And to me, nothing gets better than that. So, suddenly if I was going to have Henry Threadgill and then, some guy from playing in 1920s style,
right,
it would be too much of a mismatch. But with Henry Threadgill, which was pretty damn amazing.
Now that we have sort of, reached the borders of territory that the younger ones will be a little more comfortable with, maybe we can start with the first exposures. I mean, that's where the history comes from. And then there's, of course, the personal history. Arjun, where did your love affair start?
My love affair started with, my brother gave me a CD. I have a 5-year elder brother, and he gave me a CD, which I thought he gave me out of the goodness of his heart and his love for me as a brother, but he didn't like it. And it was Louis Armstrong playing W.C. Handy's Blues.
Oh.
It was such a beautiful place to start. But also I still remember, because that sound started creeping in and I'm like, holy shit, this is incredible. And then around the same time, Star World started. And they had, I hate the East, they're both the best, but baby, if you know what I mean. I love being here with you. Yeah. One of the ads on Star World had Tony Bennett singing I Love Being Here With You, if I'm not mistaken, as the soundtrack. And I was like, shit, this isn't, and before that, like, TV channels didn't have the kind of, like, even the ads didn't have that kind of music. And I was like, holy shit, that's very similar to the sound that I got on that CD, which I've been listening to for the last year. And then I started sort of diving down the rabbit hole and trying to find more of the music.
You still remember the first one you played on piano?
On piano, you know what? I started with classical piano.
Okay.
But the first standard that I played on piano was an arrangement of I'm Beginning to See the Light. So yeah, but at that point I didn't know how to improvise. I didn't understand harmony. I was just reading sheet music and playing a beautiful tune. Sure. But the first tune I improvised on, I shudder, saying it because of what Mr. Fernandes said just 15 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, but it was Fly Me to the Moon, one of the pop jazz tunes.
There's gateway drugs and then there's the real stuff. So it's always great to taste the gateways. Aditya, where did your jazz story begin?
Jazz story. Actually, my roots are more rock. So I was like this rock guitar player. I mean, I still am. But, it started with more like Floyd, the Eagles. So I was, that's sort of what my, initial sort of love for music began with. And then when I got into guitar players like Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, I heard that they were doing a lot of modal music, like they would, and then that sounded like this Indian, a lot of the modes have this Indian sort of parallel connection. So I was big in Indian music as well. Like I was listening to Ali Akbar Khan Saab, Amjad Ali Khan, and I was listening to a lot of instrumental music. So I was very much drawn to very like complex sort of melodic sounds and all that. And then when I heard, somebody gave me a tape of Coltrane. Initially, it just blew my mind because I couldn't understand what was going on. And then when I heard Kind of Blue, it had the sort of modal openness and that just hit me. It just hit me on a very, very deep level. And that was my gateway to jazz. And then from there, I sort of linked that harmony and was able to sort of understand what melodic influences I was going for. That was for me a very strong influence in the early, yeah.
You also had that fantastic, though very short-lived band with Sohail, where you were experimenting quite a bit with the sarangi sound and your acoustic guitar. Age has robbed me of the name though. What was that called?
Are you talking about Incognito, like the early?
No, not Incognito. There was you and Sohail who had done.
Like Adi and Sohail. It was just like a duo thing. Is that
Adi
you
and
mean
Sohail,
that? Yeah, but before many years ago, that's when we started Incognito, which actually led to Advaita. Where we were experimenting, and people were thinking, "What are we doing?" Like we were completely like outcast. We actually went to to an IIT festival where it was metal bands, you know, like those early sort of thing. We went and played with the Sarangi and we were doing all that. People thought we were crazy. We were just crazy people for that time, you know.
I've had the pleasure of interviewing you on radio as incognito, as Adi Sohail, and in the early years of
Advaita
when
yeah.
you used to get tired after 3 songs and then it started to taper off. All of those were brilliant times for experimental music, so to speak. Shubh, you've sort of, taken up the the flag for jazz, for a lack of any lower way of saying it. Where was your story? Where was the beginning of your story?
It's funny. I think I represent the like generation of musician that with jazz was very much like the academic institution thing that you study. Unfortunately, because my gateway was like Aaron Parks, Robert Glasper, like very contemporary, you know. But like it was because it was mixed with R&B and rock, and it was palatable to my taste, which was like, you know, rock from like the late 90s, early 2000s. But it's funny when we talk about this and we talk about the disappearance of jazz for those 2 decades in Indian sort of culture. I wonder like how much the resurgence of it in the early 2000s was just because of basically American music education. And I think that's what I fell into, was this like very educated, fossilized sort of thing. And then obviously through contemporary New York sounding jazz, it was then like Montgomery and George Benson and all those guitar players, Joe Pass and stuff. But the gateway was actually pretty far removed from anything that resembled jazz even like 20, 30 years ago. Which is, it's kind of an interesting thing where I think there was a loss in this like Indianness in jazz. You know, like when I was studying jazz, there was no Indian heroes or people I could look to. And it was just, you know, like learning about Vijay Iyer was like a revelation, even though jazz has been pretty Indian from the sounds of it. And just from this conversation, it's been a pretty indigenous Indian thing for about like 100 years. But unfortunately, I didn't, you know, I grew up in a generation that didn't remember that or had no record, you know, just none of that. So yeah, my gateway was like much later and was,
That's a very interesting point, actually. Naresh, did we have heroes at that point of time? Were there like super popular jazz stars before sort of the 80s and the Bollywood music took over? Were there like authentic jazz stars that we had in the firmament?
You know, the Indian, very few of them actually recorded. And to have stars, you need to have on just a live audience.
Sure.
So even now, we only have descriptions of what people, how good these guys were. The recordings that we have from that early period of the 30s and 40s is mainly popular dance music. So they swing a little. We can imagine what they sounded like in a jazz context, but we have no real idea.
Sure. That's you need repetition for popularity, and there was a lack of that for sure.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about was even just thinking about standards that we play today. I mean, you know, if we had tracked Indian jazz from, let's say, and the culture of it hadn't, you know, petered away, like a lot of the standards we should be playing in India should be, you know, like Chick Chocolate songs and things like that. I mean, they shouldn't, I mean, not to sort of romanticize jazz in India, but like, you know, there's a homegrownness to it that I think today, at least from myself and maybe people my age, like there is no homegrownness Indian jazz to like jazz, you know what I mean? It's we're just kind of grabbing whatever like American things we think is jazz, but you know, I mean,
Arjun, you had a point to make, I think.
So there's one point that I was making is that I have to, I kept a hard stop for 4 p.m. So I have 10 minutes left. I have to pick up the French band that's playing tonight and head to the club. So, but other than that, Shubh, I agree quite intensely because Shubh, you're 10, 15 years after me. So Addy and I are about the same generation. I don't put you and I in the same generation. Addy and I go back a generation above you. And it's exactly the same thing. There was no Indian hero. For me, fortunately, I found a teacher who I loved, absolutely adored as a human being and as a musician. And he was just an incredibly phenomenal piano player. But the fact is that he also hasn't left a musical legacy because there are no recordings, there are no, you know, and I mean, and he he taught me what it means to be a virtuoso. Virtuosity in music for me is not about speed or velocity. It became a very simple one-line definition. The ability to make your listener feel your emotion, to be able to use your instrument to express your emotion. That for me is virtuosity.
Yeah.
And that's what my teacher taught me. He could make me laugh, he could make me cry by just playing the piano. And even for somebody of that caliber, at that level, I mean, Shubh doesn't know that he was there.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would in studying jazz, I think I would have been much more drawn to it when I was intensely studying it. Had I known about, had I been studying about Anthony Gonzalez or Chick Chocolate or any of these people, it would have felt like my music as an Indian person studying jazz. But it felt extremely alien. It still does to a certain degree feel quite alien to me, especially the jazz from the 30s and the 40s. Feels like this is not my music, you know. But it shouldn't be that case.
Because Arjun has to leave, Piano Man, this is actually not your first attempt at trying to do what you're doing with the Piano Man. I remember that that little establishment that you had in the Priya complex, which was the first Piano Man, where you actually got this little performance space and you got people who would experiment with music come and play, and it was a completely vegetarian place.
Yeah, well, that's a different.
So, but the courage of. But what I'm saying is that the courage of conviction was still there to provide a platform. As you said,
it actually I explain, because this is so when we opened the first outlet, the intent was not to be a platform. The intent was just to create exposure. So I put a little piano there. It was a 22, 23 seater tiny little cafe, and I used to sit and play the entire day, morning to night. I had a Yamaha upright which I bought secondhand to someone, which is also currently with me still. And that's all it was. Like, good music. I thought good music. I was the one playing, so I can't comment. And then eventually, after about a year and a half, musician friends of mine are like, "Yeah, hame bhi bajane de." Like, we'd also. I'm like, of course, please come and play. But I don't know how to. In fact, for example, the roots of the silent song we do also started there, because Paddy was playing one day. Paddy is this beast of a piano player from Kolkata, for the people who are listening, don't know. And there was we're a tiny little cafe in Vasant. We had a lot of first milnis for the arranged marriages used to happen there. So there were two families sitting on one big table, and the boy and the girl sitting on a different table meeting each other, and they were bloody loud. Yeah, the families. So I just turned around and said, "Shut up," And Paddy turned to me. He's like, "Can I tell him to shut up?" I'm like, "Yeah, please, dude. Whatever you want to do." So he told him, and they got really pissed, and they came out and they started eating me out, saying, "What the hell? How can you?" I was like, "Hey, he's the musician. You got to do what he says." So the Piano Man, as it exists today as a performance venue, grew from that, as opposed to us trying to build a venue and then building this, right? So we didn't know what we were doing. We were new to F&B. And the approach to that first cafe was from the F&B perspective and not the music perspective. And once we realized a little more about who we are and what we want to do, we pivoted completely and said, let's approach the music first and the F&B second.
So now that that the music is as much a part of the personality as the food is, what is the process of curation that you have as far as the music is concerned? I mean, is there that now that the name is an established one, is it easier to get bands, or is it still the embassy bit, etc.? How does curation happen?
It's still it's not an easy process. This actually addresses something that Naresh said a little earlier. Sorry, I took the liberty of saying Naresh instead of Mr. Fernandes for the ease of conversation. What he said a little earlier about how, somebody's father loved jazz, so they played jazz, and then he passed away, and the second generation. The idea, as engineer, systems are very important for me. So the idea behind everything that we do is, how do we turn it into a propagable system? Something that is independent of my presence, is independent of somebody else's, because the day, as long as any organization depends on any one person, it will fail at some point. It can't be perennial. So we're trying to build a product which is which has a underlying ethos, which is to bring exposure to, say, non-commercial Western music in the Indian market with a focus on jazz, right? So how do we build a system around it so that any new person who comes in as a part of our curation team is over a finite, definite period of time, understand our methodology and continue that process? That is what we're trying to build. And, a lot of what's happening in terms of programming a calendar right now is systematized. My team understands what they need to do. I actually sit with them, to the programming team, specific to programming, no more than once a week. And then they run the show from there. Obviously, it's not a perfect system. We're still trying to figure stuff out. We're still trying to improve how we work. But it's a long way ahead of, everything being dependent on one person's taste and preference.
Sure. Also, not just as a musician, or maybe also as a musician and as an entrepreneur who's now also a little dependent on the kind of music that is played at the venue. What do you see the scene as right now?
What do I see? The scene is, it's very interesting. Yeah. This question comes to me very often. And Addy will, I keep saying Addy because we're approximately the same. In fact, when I started performing post-school, and a couple of years after that, when I started playing jazz, and one of the first people I sat down with was when Tarun and Addy came back from Berkeley, and Tarun came home right here in this room.
Yeah, I remember that. That was fun.
Yeah, it was fun, dude. I was petrified, dude. And Tarun gave me an earful also. Not very polite way. What do you do? I was like, oh shit, what do I do? The first two times
you lost the form like that.
Yeah. The first two times I got eaten out were both drummers. One was Tarun and one was Joshua. So, but at that point of time, Sarthak, there were 5 people trying to play that kind of music. In this.
Yeah.
Today, there's 25 people who can play to a high degree of proficiency across instruments, and another 50 people who are trying to learn it or incorporate elements of it into their music. For example, what Shubh was saying, that I've taken elements of the academic elements of it and incorporating it with the kind of music that he's producing and making. Like Addy said, he's taking elements and the academia behind jazz and incorporating it into what he does. Similarly, there are a lot of pop, rock, funk, blues, you name it, different types of musicians, again, from that spectrum of, and also from the spectrum of commercial music, but more from the outside of it, who are interested in learning more about, jazz harmony, the extended harmonic library, understanding how improvisation works and how they can utilize it as a tool. That's what it's about, right? So it's an exponentially larger market in a 12, 13, 14, 15-year period. But the growth rate is, it's not a linear curve. It's a growing curve. So the two most important things, exposure and education. And exposure is something that is now sort of, thanks to also your YouTubes and your Apple Musics and your whatever else, it's so easy to find the music you want to listen to. It also gets noisy because there's so much, so easily accessible. But the other aspect of it is like, why do guys like Shubh have to go and study abroad? Education, that's where GMI and people like GMI come in, is to create a stable, solid, high quality education base in India.
But viability, Arjun, viability of being a musician in the scenario that we are in?
Viability today is, so far ahead of what it was 15 years ago. There's so many musicians who are making, fair enough, a lot of the money that you end up making does come from playing the more commercial gigs, right? But at the same time, there are musicians who don't want to compromise on that, and they're making money as teachers. They're making money, look at Vasundhara. Vasundhara is not somebody who, but she's also at a very sort of high level of proficiency and professionalism.
Yeah.
So reputation. But there are a lot of other people, younger people in the Delhi music scene, who at the age of 24, 25, 26 are earning more money than I was earning at 32, 33. Playing music. And I had already started my business by then. So this is fact. This is not like, but again, there are success stories and the, not so successful stories as well. But at the same time, the thing is that it is possible today because the market has a demand and it doesn't have a saturation of supply. And the demand is growing and the supply is growing. The basic economics, these factors are on the sort of uptrend. Right now, while we've been talking, I've got 3 WhatsApp messages asking for jazz bands for 3 different events across the first 2 weeks of May. So, right.
Excellent. It's 4 o'clock already. Are you going to be staying with us a little longer, or?
What we can do now is I'm going to mute myself and turn my video off so I can keep listening to you guys, but I'll get on the road.
Okay. Okay.
And then once I'm in my car, then I can also chime in if needed.
For sure. For sure.
See you, Arjun.
Yeah.
Coming to the viability of being a musician, Shubh, you've sort of straddled the space both in the home of jazz and in India as well. And you've also experimented a lot with the sound. I mean, the first time I saw two drummers in a jazz band performing in Delhi was phenomenal. It gave me hope. And, I have the luxury of hope because my bills aren't paid by getting the music out to people. But yours is. So what's the nails and hammers scene like? What's the bills scene like being a musician who's playing predominantly jazz music?
That's an interesting question, because similar to what Arjun just said, I make a lot of my money, and a lot of my friends make their money from playing commercial gigs, and a lot of it is commercial music. And it's funny, like, ironically, I live in sort of the home of jazz. I mean, today, like, New York City is, synonymous with jazz, but I think it's pretty difficult to just be a jazz musician in New York today without having to sort of play commercial music or play jazz in contexts that are commercialized, like a wedding cocktail or something like that, which is fine. But yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say if you're compromising on something or you're not compromising on something by choosing certain gigs that are commercial, if you do identify as being a jazz musician. But it's not like you can't just be a jazz musician today. I think that's quite clear, unless you play at one of the highest levels and you have some of the biggest gigs. Like, of course, if you play at Jazz at Lincoln Center every week or a couple of times a week, you're probably fine. But for the majority of the musicians who graduate with, jazz degrees and things like that, they're not predominantly playing only jazz. There's a lot of other supplementing that's happening, I think.
Adi, you'll of course be able to sort of cement that a little. Are you preparing, because obviously you have an extensive jazz curriculum, are you also preparing the musicians for the hard knocks? I mean, it's great to delude yourself or maybe tell yourself that, oh, there's opportunities, but clearly there aren't as many to pay the bills as purely a jazz musician. So are you preparing the next generation for the hard knocks as well?
Yeah, I mean, see, one of the things that we always reiterate is that we're not a jazz school. Like, jazz is just one style of music, right? Like, there's so many styles of music. So jazz is just one style of music. Now, I think where it gets a little bit tricky is where, because jazz harmony has evolved so much, as a canon, as a space to study, it's a very good art form to kind of study harmonically, melodically, and because of improvisation, there's a lot of room for us to study and learn from. Just like with classical music, like, you can argue the same, that you could spend 15 years learning classical music and then say, oh, what will I do as a classical musician? But the knowledge and that goes with Indian classical music, Western classical music, anything that has such a large body of work, it develops so much over the years as an art form, as something that's so technically sort of challenging in music. So definitely there's a lot of value in studying it for studying it, like the sake of studying, just that there's so much value in it. And then what we're doing is that we really prepare our students to understand the current scenario in music, right? Everybody is aware that we don't have ownership models, we have access models now. So what does that mean? Where people, let's say, whether it's jazz or blues or whatever, people were selling records, and that was sort of the main way of earning money. Now it's streaming. How does that work? Then when you talk about live gigs, how does that work? So definitely we're not sort of trying to be like, oh, now you come to this program and then you're going to be this amazing jazz musician. That is really nowhere in the picture. Also, not everybody here studies jazz. It's one of the forms that we do. Many people are focusing on Indian music, many people are focusing on electronic music, and then there is this sort of crossover that happens when you study all these forms of music. What goes out and what people come up with is totally up to them, and then they sort of create their own artistic identity, and they figure out how they want to use their roots, their influences to build an audience. And that is central to any form of music, right? So the same sort of thing applies to whether you do Korean jazz, or whether you do Mumbai jazz, or whether you do blues, or whether you do rock music or whatever, totally carries forward in that sense.
Sure. There's also the perception, you tell someone you're a jazz musician, and then there's that jazz version of the stank face, like that.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit of an irony that that music that started off as a bit of a relief from racism has now become so elitist that people, only, there's that whole perception that's happening as well. Naresh, you of course, seen it from the perspective, from a very academic perspective as well. The intimidation of jazz has also led to a lot of misinformation. I mean, there's this fantastic bit by Osho where he said that, I'm sure you must have seen that. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but for the sake of...
Oh yeah, something jazz. Can you read that?
He basically says, it's not like jazz music. Not even monkeys listen to jazz. In fact, only monkeys listen to jazz music. It is not music, just a bunch of crackpots getting together to make noise. That, according to Osho, was the definition of jazz. And there's been many versions of these as well. So you think there's a bit of a perception problem with jazz as well, Naresh? You think from the beginning to now, is there a comparison to be made there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a fully paid up monkey, and
so am I.
Eat crackpots.
Yeah,
and I think also some of it is to do with the fact that some of the crackpots have taken themselves so seriously in some contexts. Just haven't allowed the monkeys to realize how appealing and really infected, how you can really get infected by this music and hop up and down. I mean, when kids come over to visit, I like to put on especially some of the really early things, maybe some of the early Dixieland stuff, and you see kids smile immediately. They sort of break out into spontaneous dances.
Yeah.
And as Aditya was saying, sort of there's a spectrum of things. There's the music evolved, and you catch it at the stage at which you can where it gets to you, and then you move on to the more abstract points. But yeah, if you're going to listen to Eric Dolphy to begin with, perhaps, you won't get into the music.
And I think also the fact that the labels tend to sort of block the ears a little. No, I mean, the music remains as beautiful. It's just that with the label on your ear, you can't hear it or appreciate it. Which I think, but that's the thing I think about the music. Have you, Shubh, as a performer? There's so much exposure right now. I was doing this communication class, and there was this fascinating line that one of the professors had quoted. He said that with the democratization of art, the perception of our heroes has changed. The people who are heroes for us, because it was such a community experience to go and watch a Michael Jackson, or, the heroes for us were a more larger than life figure. And now I think because of the democratization of the access, heroes are much more individual in that way. Have you seen audience perception about your music change from the time you started to now, where, it's been an explosion of musical information, so to speak?
Yeah, 100%. And specifically within jazz, I have this conversation with a lot of people who are like other friends, that you want to stay. There's like a resistance to call yourself jazz now, especially like you don't want to be the jazz band because the perception is that you play a certain style of music, or that it's ironically very academic music. And so we try to say,
dated, or
or like really dated or something. So I mean, I myself am like other friends who I think I would consider are heavily influenced by jazz education, at least, that we stray away from calling it jazz, or call it fusion or rock or prog jazz, and there's so many words for it that are hyphenated with jazz something, which just goes to show that there's this like resistance to label it jazz. And it to a certain degree, like it isn't jazz in the sense of what we really, the public perceives jazz, which is like a few decades of music in the mid 1900s. But like it's funny that when we call instrumental music rock music, people are much more likely to listen to it and have a certain reaction to it. People are more likely to dance to it if you call it something else. But if you call it jazz, there's the audience themselves, I think, doesn't feel like they can, like Mr. Fernandes was saying, jump around to it and dance to it, and it's taken just far too seriously, and it shouldn't be. But there's also kind of a counterculture to that, like someone like Lewis Cole, like Knower and things like that, where they're really like goofy, funny musicians who are extremely talented, come from this jazz school, and they don't take themselves too seriously, but the music is incredible. And that is like also like a bit growing trend, I think, maybe in sort of to counter some of the seriousness that jazz now has.
I think there are a lot of musicians who sort of taken up the fact that at the end of the day, it is music and it is progressions. The likes of Wolfpack and Fearless Flyers have sort of, just made listening to it and the whole perception of it so much lighter, because they're just out there to have a little bit of fun. May
I add something?
Yes, please.
The fact is that, it is art music. Some of it fun, some of it is art music. It takes work on the part of the listener to try to figure out what musicians are doing. They're very serious musicians. It is an abstract music. Not everybody gets, Hindustani classic, khayal immediately, for instance. It takes some education. And so again, I think, you get onto the train at various stations, but, eventually you want to take that ride with the music and with individual performers. So everything can't be goofy, is what I wanted to add. So I didn't mean any sort of disrespect to the performers to say that they take themselves too seriously. Of course, you have the right to. I mean, everybody is thinking about their art in a really sort of intense, focused way. And there'll be spectrums of this art.
Right. Yeah,
and I also think that also depends on the kind of audiences that you're catering to. As you said, I mean, even in classical music, if you were to look at it right now, there are a lot of young classical musicians who are actually straddling the space where they're doing that whole fusion bit, the fun bit for the audiences, but they're also hardcore classical musicians. I think that is also happening a lot in jazz, as Shubh said. The likes of Vijay Iyer and Rudresh Mahantappa. All of these people have those Indian roots, but they're not compromising on the art of the music. And even Aaron Parks, he's got some fantastic stuff that he's done with James Farm, for example, where Joshua Redman is playing with him. So I think there has to be a little bit of the straddling and maybe a little bit of the understanding of the audiences, because at the end of the day, I think audiences are important as well, isn't it, Naresh?
And so sort of, this period that I was writing about in the 40s and 50s, especially in Bombay, was a time when, a lot of this audience, which was sort of middle class, upper middle class, Goan, Parsi, they all took music lessons. So they could understand what was happening. And also they were going for the Western classical concerts and the jazz concerts. Music, again, that genre of music was a spectrum. But audiences were educated. I think audiences are less likely to know even the basic theory now, which then means that you can't quite, appreciate what's happening or enjoy what's happening.
Sure. Which is why I think education becomes a little important, and that thin line between what true education is and what catering to an audience is becoming a little blurred today, because one of my favorite sayings right now is that we have too much education, we have too much information, which is completely passive and all around us, and too little knowledge, because knowledge is an active pursuit, right? And because there's so much information, we are forgetting that line between information and knowledge is blurring so much. And you've taken it upon yourself to actually impart that knowledge. Must be a burden on the shoulders, no, Adi?
I mean, no, I think it was just, I think I was just, as a learner of and as an appreciator of music, like I just wanted to learn more about it, and that sort of drew me. And I think that is what even like Shubh and Naresh were talking about, where there are people who are driven towards understanding the deeper nuances of any music or that art form. Let's say, like, draw a parallel comparison where there was one point where jazz was the pop of the time, right? So that's when it was the popular music, right? And then it's gone through periods where, let's say 70s, 80s, where it went into very different sort of periods. There's bop, there's post-bop, where it became this art music where the normal audience was probably listening to the pop of the day, but they weren't really driven to explore this fringe music or whatever you want to call it. Same thing with Indian music, where let's say khayal was a pop of that time, and it was like Drupad gave way into khayal, but khayal became the pop of the time. But now people are taking to it as an art form where they're going back in history but trying to preserve it, not to preserve it, but there's some kind of relationship, or there's some kind of artistic relation they have with that art form, that they've gone into it and they embody that art form for the sake of embodying it, right? And then comes, okay, how do I make money with this? Or if I cannot, how do I supplement? That becomes sort of a secondary thing, because there is this love of music that you get like smitten by, and then you just can't deal with it. You just have to kind of do that music. That is sort of another space that we can talk about, and that's kind of how it works. And I think there are some forms of music where you do need an educated audience to appreciate it.
Sure.
It's just the way it is, you know.
Which actually would be a fascinating question to ask Shubh. You know, we've been talking about the fact that it is an art form. So, you know, between the responsibility to the art form itself and a responsibility to the audience, that must be a bit of a tightrope for you when you're performing, no?
Definitely. Yeah, 100%. And especially when you function in this larger umbrella of jazz, there is a certain like homage that I don't know if you should pay, but you definitely feel the pressure that you have to pay respect towards the music that came before you. You are part of a lineage of education and practices that have been sort of passed down. Even if you learn at an institution, it's still, you're part of this longer sort of thread. So there is a little, it is an important, there is a weight that you have to sort of carry. But, you know, it's interesting. Maybe I'm wrong in this, but I've always tried to be really authentic in just the way I've felt about how the music that I want to create in terms of what I like listening to and what I like playing. And the rule I've set for myself is that if it needs to sound a certain way, because that's the way I hear it, then it'll be that. But I won't try to make it sound more jazzy or less jazzy, depending on who I'm playing for, or like where I'm playing it. Which, you know, it's a difficult sort of thing to, it's a difficult fence to sort of, or line to walk on, because, you know, you can of course question what is authentic taste and things like that. But, you know, like when you call yourself jazz or jazz adjacent musician, you do have to carry certain parts, elements of the tradition, whether you like it or not. And so there is a conscious effort not to disrespect that tradition, but at the same time, you also have to sort of be authentic to the lack of jazz musician you may be, you know, to a certain degree. And so that's something that I think about constantly. But yeah, that's an interesting thought, though, for sure.
The question, Naresh, here was that the responsibility while performing as a musician for Shubh, you know, that fine line between his responsibility to the art and his responsibility to the audience. How does he tread that? What does he feel about that? So that was, I saw that you had logged out, so I thought I'd sort of catch you.
I hadn't logged out. I think my video flickered.
Okay. Brilliant. Shivankit, just wanted to know. I'm always very full of questions. I don't really know when to stop. If you need me to wrap up, just let me know.
Sure, we can wrap up in another 15 minutes.
Sorry,
Okay.
This responsibility to art and responsibility to audience is something that I'd love to sort of chime in on for a second. Because it is a genuine it's a genuinely complicated topic, which honestly has a very simple answer. You know, at the simplest, the root as a venue, I would always tell an artist, your responsibility lies to your art, because everything flows from there. Unfortunately, the reality is that is not how most venues operate. Mm-hmm. For most venues, the responsibility lies towards the audience, because that's where the revenue is. Yeah. And but the truth of the matter is, anyone who's made it fairly successful as an artist, and I'm not talking about the big artists, but I'm talking about the young guys on the local scenes, is usually because they have a unique, or they have their own voice, they have their own sound, which is what helps people remember them, identify them. And as much as people say that what you need to do is play to the audience remembers the people who play to their own art. And this is what I've observed over 5,500 concerts in my own club.
Sure. That makes sense. So, you know, and sorry, you had something more to say, Arjun? Sorry. Oh, okay.
Oh, no. Sorry, I'm driving, so I'm going to keep
focus
on the road.
Yeah. Talking of fine lines, Naresh, the thing I find fascinating is the fact that to pick your brains is something that's been absolutely brilliant in this conversation, because the dispassionate nature of your profession as a journalist and the sheer passion that you hold for the music it'd be just so brilliant to know how you look at the audiences, how you look at the progression of jazz through the journalistic gaze and through a true fan's gaze. Is there a difference there? How do you approach your these two seeming disparities?
It's not a seeming disparity. I have one identity. I'm a journalist. I tell stories. And to me, this was a fascinating story to tell. Just happened that it sort of overlapped with a lot of my experiences of my neighborhood and the things I heard around me. So it was a story that I was able to tell, I think, with a little more knowledge. But no, I'm only one thing. What you see is what you get.
That's fantastic. But did you ever get the fan stepping on the journalist's toes from time to time with the stories?
So I was careful in my book not to make any great claims for the music, because you couldn't listen to it. So I always said, I was quoting to say this person said this about this concert, about this person's style, because the journalist didn't. I mean, there was no way to corroborate that. So yeah, that I was careful not to sort of go into flights of fancy and fantasy and nostalgia for a period that perhaps may not have existed quite the way the people who participated in it want us to believe it did.
Sure. The imagination is a great thing, isn't it? it can build some wonderful stories. But Naresh, how do you see the progression of the scene, for lack of any better way of explaining it, from the time that you started reading about it or trying to find out more about it, to the time where you have literally a glut of information about what's going on?
I mean, the internet is this amazing thing. It brings information from around the world, but also from down the road. And suddenly I find all of these performers in my city, across the country, who I would never have any way of finding if, in the old traditional way, if somebody had to hold a concert once a year, they would look for sponsors. Then we hear of these names. Like, for instance, in the one guy I've never heard is Konarak Reddy, who I had for years and decades heard about, this virtuoso in Bangalore, and I don't think he's ever actually played a concert in Bombay over the last 2 or 3 decades. But now finally I get a chance to, see his recordings. And so the internet, I think, has been fantastic in allowing us to find out about, our own, the local scene, in addition, of course, to bringing all these albums from a variety of periods and spaces. I mean, like when I was growing up, I'd heard 2 or 3 Brazilian albums, and just they were not available in India because HMV didn't release them. And suddenly I have all these albums I can pull up, but I have no idea if this guy's a club performer, if he's a superstar.
Of course.
So that's one of the problems now. You have, when I was in college, I'm a very old man, but there was a Rolling Stone record guide. And you'd look at that record guide and say, it has 5 stars, so it must be good. So when your cousin went to America, you said, get me that album with 5 stars. And now you have no way of figuring out. There's no, again, that was a process of education. It sort of told you, why that 5-star album was so good. Now, just listen and hope that your ears will be your guide.
Ours was the Archie's songbook, where we would figure out exactly how wrong we had gone in trying to translate the English lyrics.
Yeah, in Bombay we had something called pop hits. Pop hits volumes, and they all came with little chords in the top. They were all, C, G, C. I mean, all the basic stuff, so you could play along with them. Yeah, we got a lot of the lyrics really quite wrong.
Adi, finally, music as a profession or even as a vocation and as education has for quite a while been sort of influenced by fads. I mean, at one point of time, the Swarnabhumi Academy of Music was sort of the cradle of all things jazz. Then of course the singer-songwriter phase came in, and everyone was in their living room with their computer creating music. How difficult is it to be taken seriously as a music school that imparts real education to people who think of music as probably a fad or something that you get your child to play in front of uncles and aunties saying "Beta gao"? So, how easy or difficult has it been to be the educator part of the music business?
A great question, and I think generally, I mean, we've seen that one of the things there is we took a look at legal professor. It takes years study sort of entry barrier. You have to take a bar exam, or you have to take your medical exam. So what ends up happening is that a lot of the people who are sort of halfway into it, or like who don't really have the sort of courage or the determination to really follow through, are weaned off. But with music, what happens is anybody who picks up the guitar, oh, I want to be a musician, all of the people are sort of vying for that, that spot. So a lot of times what happens is that it sort of in a way puts this kind of career in a light where so many do we really we're putting really see through what we want to do with our careers in music. That is one of the things that has to be sort of brought forward. Having said that, there is one thing that has changed over the years, is that the perception of what it is to be a musician and the sort of career options, where we are right now working with the Delhi government to create a program which a lot of you might have seen, which is called the Ambedkar Schools of Specialized Excellence, where now from 9 to 12 we're building a program where students who are especially gifted in music or other art forms are going to have the opportunity to have a fully funded education in music, full scholarship through 9 to 12. That is supported by the Delhi government, and then they will be also creating scholarships for students to go abroad and other universities in India to follow through and study music. Because again, we've seen that, for example, let's say, again bringing back the idea of medicine, you need those 8 years of hardcore study to be able to say that I now have that sort of knowledge of medicine. So, but with music, what is happening, or with any other art form, let's say you want to be a painter, we do need those years of disciplined work to really develop your craft. You can't just be one camera and happen in very places where you it, but you ask concept, what we talk about, Malcolm Gladwell, where who is putting that work into it. So you can't just say, oh yeah, 2 months later I want to be this successful musician. Overnight it doesn't happen. And you've heard that overnight success story happened 10 years, it took 8 years of work, and then that overnight success story happened. So I think that's the sort of ethos that we need to understand, that really that work needs to be put into your craft and understanding the business of music. Then you can sort of see that we have successful careers in music. You can make a successful career in music. And I always joke, you can make a successful career in music is a one sentence, but you can make a success is based on you, like what you put into it makes that. So whether it's possible to make a career in arts and music is definitely true, but for you, whether it's possible, it depends on you, what you do with it, how you sort of build your audience, your brand, your identity, how you find your audience. That has stayed the course of Mozart, Indian classical.
Sure.
To work, you put in, sort of work through the industry, yeah.
And one final question to all of you. First, of course, Adi, four-letter question. Is it worth it?
Hell yes. Goodbye.
For me, it's worth it.
That's Arjun saying it is. And Arjun, have a great show in the evening, man.
Yeah. For me it is. But then I can't speak for everybody, right? So.
Yeah, for you it is. Shubh, is it worth it?
Yeah.
It's worth it. It's worth it if again, yeah, I can't speak for anybody else, but if it's something that gives you meaning, it's worth it.
Is it worth it for you being a musician? Is it worth it? Totally a personal question.
Yes, 100%. It is worth it.
Naresh, is it worth it telling the stories?
Oh, definitely. Musicians are fascinating people. I mean, the sex and drugs and rock and roll thing, great subjects. So,
always great to tell those stories. And Naresh, thank you very much. First and foremost, thank you very much for that master class. I mean, this has been an education.
Yeah, that was fascinating.
Thanks for having me.
It's been absolutely wonderful.
And it's been lovely to listen to these gentlemen who I know of only by reputation. So faces and voices.
Yeah, it was fascinating. Thank you.
Shubh, absolutely wonderful. I've been a long-term fan. It's been wonderful having this.
200% likewise. The feeling is doubly mutual. It's twice backwards.
Adi, thank you so much. It's great to see the conviction with which you are trying to make music keep its best step forward. So thank you very much for that, and all the very best.
Thank you, and thank you to you.
Thank you.
And you've been, keeping this alive for so many years. You were telling the stories of us musicians. You've given us a voice, to share what we're doing. Whether it's 100 people listening or 10,000, that you play a big role in that. So thank you.
You were my first radio interview was you. Actually, maybe first and last, I think. So only interview I've done on radio is you.
It's been a ride, and it's been made much more beautiful for a non-musician like me, because you guys have brought your music, and you've brought those stories, and you've brought that feeling, more importantly. And you could name it jazz, you could name it pop, but as long as it makes you bob your head and tap your feet, or even wiggle your toes while you're driving, I think the purpose is served. So thank you very much for this conversation. It was absolutely wonderful.
Shivank, thank you for putting this together.
Shivank, thank you. Yeah, so much.